Hello everyone. Welcome to the last session of Second Language Acquisition and Psycholinguistics. In this session, we are going to discuss language and thought. In particular, what is the relationship between our thought and the language that we use. Why we need to understand the relationship between language and thought? Perhaps because we typically think in words, language and thought seem completely intertwined. Indeed, scholars in various fields such as philosophy, psychology, linguistics, anthropology, as well as lay people have entertained these questions. First, is thought possible without language? Next, does the structure of our language shape our thinking? Or does our perception or cognition shape the structure of language? Finally, are our abilities to learn and use language part of our general intelligence? So all these questions actually created a kind of enigma, and we'll try to give you some concepts figuring these questions out. In theorizing language and thought, we might begin with the classical theorists like Plato, Aristotle. They argued that the categories of thought determine the categories of language. To them, language is only the outer form or expression of thought. Another view was expressed by the behaviorist J.B. Watson, an American psychologist and the founder of behaviorism. According to him, thought is language. He believed that thought is subvocal speech, that is, when we think aloud, it is called speech, and when we speak covertly, it is called thinking. A less radical position is that language determines thought. According to this view, the categories of thought are determined by linguistic categories. Theorists within this group are divided between those who think that language completely determines cognitive categories and those who merely say that language strongly influences cognitive categories. A long-standing claim concerning the relationship between language and culture is the structure of a language determines the way in which the speakers of that particular language view the world. This view is called linguistic determinism. A somewhat weaker version of this is that the structure doesn't determine the view but is still extremely influential in predisposing speakers of a language towards adopting a particular worldview. This is called linguistic relativism. In this connection, we might refer to a popular theory of language and thought, which is known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as we know it today, can be broken down into two basic principles. The first one is linguistic determinism, which is also known as the stronger version, and the other one is linguistic relativity, which is also known as the weaker version of this hypothesis. In linguistic determinism, it is believed that language itself determines thought, and different languages impose different conceptions of reality to its user. On the other hand, in linguistic relativity, language influences thinking, and linguistic differences between cultures are associated with cultural differences in thinking. So these are the two versions of the same hypothesis. Edward Sapir was a leading figure in the 20th century linguistics and anthropology. Educated at Columbia University and initially a student of German philology, He became attracted to the anthropology program then newly formed by Franz Boas. Boas's project of studying the languages and cultures of North American Indians in their own right rather than as evolutionary precursors or deficient version of Europeans became Sapir's own. Yet his work grew to include linguistic topics worldwide, and his contributions in theory and analysis are among the foundations of modern linguistics. The other proponent of this hypothesis, Benjamin Lee Whorf, was born in Massachusetts. Whorf began studying linguistics at Yale University in 1931 because he was concerned about the conflict between science and religion. Being interested in the American Indians, he began to study the Hopi language while at Yale University under the supervision of Edward Sapir. He was a lecturer in anthropology from 1937 to 38, and Benjamin Lee Whorf was a successful business specialist employed by the Hartford Fire Insurance Company. Whorf studied linguistics in his spare time as a way to create an understanding of how language worked, and unfortunately, he died before much of his studies could be proven. In the field of linguistics, Whorf worked in the areas of linguistic anthropology, psychological linguistics, Mayan, and dictionary of Hopi languages. Whorf argued that language is shaped by culture and reflects the individual actions of people daily. He felt that language shaped a person's view and influenced thoughts. Today, many linguists agree with Whorf's studies. His studies, though not all were proven, help future linguists in their studies. It is generally accepted by ethnolinguists that culture influences language, but there is far less agreement about the possibility that language influences culture. Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Whorf suggested that language affects how people perceive their reality, that language coerces thought. This is known as Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Simply stated, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis says that the content of a language is directly related to the content of a culture, and the structure of a language is directly related to the structure of a culture. According to Sapir, human beings do not live in the objective world alone, nor alone in the world or social activity as ordinarily understood, but are very much at the mercy of particular language which has become the medium of expression for their society. It is quite an illusion to imagine that one adjusts to reality essentially without the use of language, and that language is merely an incidental means of solving specific problems of communication and reflection. The fact of the matter is that the real world is to a large extent unconsciously built up on the language habits of the group. Let's look at the Whorf's view. Whorf believes that uh, people dissect nature along lines laid down by their native languages. The categories and types that they isolate from the world of phenomena they do not find there because they stare every observer in the face. On the contrary, the world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions which has to be organized by our minds. And this means largely by the linguistic systems in our minds. We cut nature up organize it into concepts, and ascribe significance as we do, largely because we are parties to an agreement that holds throughout our speech community and is codified in the patterns of our language. The agreement is, of course, an implicit and unstated one, but its terms are absolutely obligatory. We cannot talk at all except by subscribing to the organization and classification of data which the agreement decrees. Now we shall try to give some examples that uh, might make you understand that language determines thought. For example, in Chinese, there is only one single term, liu tuo. In English, there is camel, but in Arabic, there are more than 400 words for the animal. So it's the it's the language that determines thought. Uh, let's give another example. The Eskimo language has a large number of words involving snow. For example, Appian, that refers to the snow on the ground, and uh, Quanica, that refers to hard snow on the ground, and Utak is the block of snow. So, for a single uh, phenomenon or single object, snow, they have different set of words to signify the different status of the snow. Whereas in other language, for example, think of English, think of Bangla. So we have a certain word, only one word for this particular item, snow. In Bengali, you can think of the rains. How many types of rains you know about? For example, the word brishti is a Bengali word uh, for rain, but in Bengali culture and in Bengali thought, there is uh, particular uh, various types of rains. For example, মুষলধারে বৃষ্টি, ঝিরিঝিরি বৃষ্টি, রিমঝিম বৃষ্টি, ইলশেগুড়ি বৃষ্টি. So all these types of different phrases actually refer to different form of the rain. But think of the word rain, which is being used in the, let's say, in the Middle East, or in particular part of the world where it is rare, it rarely occurs. So they have only one word maybe for the object rain. So these are some of the examples of language determinism. Language determines thought. Now we can give you some supporting evidence of this phenomenon. For example, we can compare contrast the Hopi language with the Western languages, looking closely at the grammatical structure. For example, the structure of tense or the idea of time. In Western languages, we perceive temporal entities as object in space. For example, we can say 4 days, similar to 4 people or 4 orange. So time and object are are being count with the uh, same language, same phenomenon, linguistic form. So 4 days equivalent to 4 people or 4 orange. Uh, Whereas Hopi perceives temporal entities as an ongoing process. Days in Hopi are cyclical, so they they cannot say they stayed 4 days. Rather, they will say they left after 4 days. That means their time is the time doesn't stop. All right, and also the tense system is very different for future and present time in both uh, Hopi language and Western languages. Already we have discussed that the Eskimo people have many more words for to describe snow than other people, other linguistic community. We can think of also the Piraha tribe from Brazil. They only have a few words for counting. For example, they can count one, two, and many. They do not count three, four, five, or six, or 10. All right. So after one, two, they count as many. Navajo only have one word for blue and green. So the same word being used for blue and they were use only one word for blue and green. The Russian has two separate words for dark blue and sky blue. Italians ride in a bicycle in a country. The stronger version of linguistic determinism is not free from flaws. So, linguistic determinism is a too strong claim and thus could be false. People's thought and perceptions are not determined by the words and structures of their language. We are not prisoners of our linguistic system, according to Fromkin et al. So, uh, our language cannot actually uh, captivate our thinking. Human thinking, according to Fromkin, is much more wider and widespread. Other language speakers may not have the exact word but are able to express their ideas and thoughts using other words and word combinations. So, uh, this idea is relevant in translation study with translation studies. So, often people claim that it is not possible to translate one idea from one language to another exactly or completely, but uh, uh, the there are researchers who believe that actually we can translate uh, ideas from one language to another if using uh, if not using the exactly the same words or same idea same expressions, we can use uh, other words, or we can use uh, we can translate our thoughts using more words from other language. The Dani tribe, who have only two color system, think of them, they can only categorize all the colors in the world either as black or as white, either dark or light. And when they were trained in another language to name the color shades, they could do it successfully. If linguistic determinism were true or were solid, in that case they were not supposed to learn to use different words for different shades of color in another language. Inuit just have a great need for more vocabulary of types of snow than us, and it is arguable whether their perception is affected. So perhaps we do not need uh, a great variety of words to term the words snow. but Inuits, they need. We rather need to term the different types of rain in our context. All right. Now we shall talk about some evidence for linguistic relativism. So there are more evidence to suggest that linguistic relativism is valid compared to linguistic determinism, and linguistic uh, relativism has influence on thought and perception. For example, we can think of the difference of languages or language differences among different nations. Um, we can also give the examples of politically correct vocabulary. For example, nowadays we do not use the terms like uh, chairman or chairwoman. We use now chairperson. Think of the term like fireman, which is thought to be a sexist term, and the politically correct term could be firefighter, which is more acceptable. Uh, we try to use these kind of expressions so that we do not harm anyone, uh, or we do not be unkind or offensive towards anyone in our language. And sometimes we use the positive, uh, positive, put positive meaning on negative ideas. Uh, for example, friendly fire, which is, we know that accidental killing of the same uh, group of soldiers by their own uh, group. So this term is uh, presented in a tactful manner, which is called friendly fire. Or instead of uh, 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 identifying someone as mentally retarded, we say mentally challenged, or physically challenged. We do not say crippled, we say physically challenged. So uh, all these uh, examples actually show that language influence our thought, um, but does not uh, determine uh, our thinking process. It might influence us, but not determine it. And the last question is, if there were no words that were sexist or racist, would our society become less sexist or racist? Obviously not. The answer is obviously not, because um, our uh, thought cannot be completely uh, determined by language. Rather, we sometimes modify our language, our thinking sometimes do the opposite. Our thoughts help to shape or reshape our language. Thank you very much for watching this video. Uh, if you have any questions, we shall discuss in our consultation session. Good luck.